When I think of past Christmases, I think of my grandparents. I think of my Nana. I remember when we were kids, my brother and I and my cousin, we would all meet at my grandparents' house in Kentucky, and every year, she would do a cookout in the living room. She'd put out a blanket, and we would cook out hot dogs in the fireplace. And I remember that memory every Christmas. And I remember my grandfather. My grandfather was a very soft-spoken man. He was always present and wanted to be with all of us, but didn't really engage in a lot of ways. Like, he wasn't super active. He didn't really play a lot, but he wanted to be near the playing. I'm sure some of you can relate to that. One Christmas, though, when my brother and I were teenagers, my dad had gotten us, for Christmas, paintball guns. And this was back when paintball guns were no joke. They were just kind of out on the market, so these things were lethal. And my dad had ordered these paintball guns for my brother and I, and he did it through the mail, and this was before Amazon Prime. So we had a problem. Only one package got there by Christmas. So at Christmas, he didn't want us to not have it, so we got one paintball gun and one protective mask. So my brother and I, of course, looked at each other and said, well, there's nothing we can do with this, and we moved on. That's not at all what happened. What really happened is we looked at the gift and said, well, there's two of us. We got one gun. We got one mask. Let's go in the backyard, see what happens. So we walk in the backyard, and we invented a game called Shoot Each Other with a Paintball Gun. We were very creative. One of us would kind of hide behind the garage, the detached garage, and then would just run back and forth between the garage and the tree. The most teenage boy thing in the world, while the other one shot the other one with paintball guns. That was the game. That was it. There was no scoring system. There was no nothing. Well, the reason I remember that is because my grandfather, who didn't really like to do a lot of stuff with us, all of a sudden took a great interest in his grandkids. And we walked out on the back porch, and he said, well, now let me have a shot. And then he took the next 30 minutes to pelt my brother and I with paintball guns. And he never said a whole lot, but when that was over, I vividly remember him handing me back my paintball gun and saying, well, now I enjoyed that. I learned that day that my grandfather's military service had well prepared him for grandsons. I dare say, if I went around the room tonight and asked for your holiday memories, if I asked for your Christmas memories, I got a feeling I'd have a bunch of those. I'd have a bunch of stories about things that took place when you were a kid, smells, sounds, meals, and I dare say that most of those would have a theme. The theme would be the relationships that those stories took place in. The theme would be the people involved in those stories. That's what the holidays are. They're a time for relationships. They're a time for us to be together with family when we may not see them the rest of the year. The holidays are an opportunity for us to reconnect and for us to build memories and for us to share moments together. They're full of joy. They're full of laughter. And all too often, they're full of heartache. They're full of longing. It's been a few years since we lost my grandparents. It's been about 3 years. They had one of those storybook romances where when Papa died, it wasn't but a few months till Nana joined him, and that didn't surprise any of us. And now Christmas is different. I've got two little boys who are making their own memories, and they're so excited, and they're so full of joy, and every aspect of Christmas is the greatest thing in the world. But there's kind of a hole, because what I experienced as a kid was not the cookouts, and it wasn't the paintball guns. It was my Nana and Papa, and they're not with us. And so there's this emptiness. Now, for me, it's a little different, because for me, I've got my two young boys that allow me to kind of get lost in the moments of Christmas. And I got to be honest with you, and I say this truthfully, I can get through our holidays without feeling the big hovering cloud. My mom is a different story. This has been only 3 years since we lost them, and my mom struggles a lot at the holidays. And it's a weird paradox, because she's got her grandkids who she loves more than anything in the world, and she wants to see them happy. But in the midst of that joy, and in the midst of the presents and the dinners, there's this underlying hum of sadness, and you never really know when it might hit. You never really know when it might strike. We can be in the middle of opening presents, and you'll notice she kind of gets quiet, and I know what that means. I dare say that if I went around the room tonight and asked you about grief, and asked you about what your grief looks like in the holidays, I imagine I'd have a lot of stories that are similar to the one I just told. A lot of people who you miss, a lot of people who you just don't feel the same around Christmas without. The relationships that we lose are the primary source of grief during the holiday season. Lost loved ones are the primary source of grief, but they're not the only source of grief. The grief I've described is losing someone close to me. But there's other sources of grief during the holiday season. There's broken relationships, marriages that ended. There's breaking relationships. There's tension between a husband and wife. There's job loss and unemployment. That can create grief during the holiday season. Life just simply not going the way that you expect. That can be a source of grief as well. Tonight, we're going to explore not just the idea of grief at the holidays, which for the record, I understand it's a hard topic, and I understand that it's not something that's enjoyable to talk about, but I think it's important. Earlier this week, and I've mentioned this to a couple of elders already, earlier this week, this was not going to be the topic I spoke about. But when I looked at my schedule, and when I looked at the phone calls I've been getting lately, and when I looked at the people who I'm seeing in the office, grief was the prominent theme. And so I felt like tonight was a good opportunity to explore it. Now, we're not going to just talk in psychological terms about the experience of grief at the holidays. What we're going to do tonight, I hope, is not depressing, and I don't want to send you out of here in tears and missing the people who you're close to. I hope to give you encouragement, because we're not just going to look at the idea of grief. We're going to look at what Jesus did with grief, and we're going to look at how his model that he created for us and how to handle our grief is the true source of comfort in this life. Grief is almost always rooted in relationships. It's almost always rooted in personal relationships. But it's not triggered by those relationships. It's triggered by external stuff, and that stuff can be confusing. Grief can be triggered by smells. It can be triggered by sounds. You can be in a grocery store picking up stuff for a holiday meal, and all of a sudden a song comes on, and it just hits like that. You can be in the middle of watching your grandkids open a present, and for some reason you go back to 40 years ago, and that feeling hits, and no one in the room knows you're experiencing it because you do your absolute best to hide it, but it hits. I'm hoping that none of what we're going to talk about tonight applies to you. I hope you're not in grief. I hope your life is amazing and wonderful, and I hope you haven't lost anybody, and I hope that this holiday season is nothing but joyous for you. But I dare say there's at least a few who that's not the case for. And even if tonight, if that's not you, if you are not one of the people who's in grief, I dare say I've got a lot of people in this room who are close to it. In all honesty, I miss my grandparents. I loved them dearly. But the issue that I struggle with at the holidays is not my own grief, it's my mom's. I struggle with how to be there for her and how to be present for her, how to recognize the pain that she goes through in the midst of this joyous, wonderful, amazing time. The good news for us is that we don't have to wing it. We don't have to figure out what to do with our grief on our own. We don't have to hide it. We don't have to pretend we're not feeling it. And I think we're going to see evidence of that in John chapter 11. Tonight we're going to be in John 11. If you want to go ahead and turn there, that's where we're going to be. We're going to be looking at the story of the death of Lazarus. This story takes place in John 11, and it takes place in 3 parts. Now, we could spend a month focusing on this story and focusing on all the different aspects of this story that are powerful and all the different aspects of the story that we can take and apply to our lives as it pertains to grief. But specifically tonight, we're only going to focus on the second part of this story. So I want to walk briefly through what's happened prior to verse 17, which is where we're going to begin. In the first 16 verses of John chapter 11, we're told that Jesus loved Lazarus and Martha and Mary, and we're told that Lazarus is sick. And in fact, Jesus then explains to his disciples that he's dead. There's a back and forth where the disciples are trying to figure out exactly what's going on and trying to figure out the language that Jesus is using, and he has to be clear and he has to explain some things. And we're gonna focus, however, on part 2, because in part 2 of this story, Jesus comforts Mary and Martha, and I think teaches us profound lessons about grief, what our grief is supposed to look like, and how we're supposed to handle it when it appears. Now, before we get into this, I want to remind you again, the goal tonight is to do a couple of things. One, to get a bit more in touch with what our grief looks like scripturally. And two, to give us something to go to when we encounter grief in our family in the holidays. I can assure you, if we'll listen, I believe God has lessons for us. I believe Jesus had lessons for us on how to manage this grief. So again, we're going to start in verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into this world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? There is a lot to take away from this story. This is a story about loss. It's about grief. It's about love. It's about faith. It's about the glory and the power of God. And we could honestly, as I mentioned earlier, spend just a month unpacking stuff about this particular story. But for the purposes of tonight and for our exploration of grief at the holidays, we're going to start in verse 35. Verse 35 is one of the most well-known scriptures in the Bible because it's the shortest, and that is Jesus wept. Oftentimes, we know that. We could recite it. If I asked you, show of hands, what's the shortest passage in the Bible, we would say Jesus wept. We would know that. But oftentimes we miss the context of what that grief was. We miss the context of why Jesus was weeping. Verse 35, Jesus wept. He wept in a moment of grief, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But before we get there, I want to make sure you understand something. Jesus wept in his grief. He understands our pain. He understands what we experience as human beings. Isaiah 53:3 describes Jesus as a man of suffering and familiar with pain. I hope that you're not experiencing this grief, but I know at some point you will. And when you do, I want you to have faith, and I want you to have comfort in the fact that Jesus experienced it too. Your grief is okay. Jesus wept, so can you. And I say that because one of the dysfunctional ways that we deal with grief at the holiday season is by pretending it doesn't exist. We're surrounded by so many things that make us happy and so many things that bring us joy that we feel selfish for grieving. We feel like there's something wrong with us. We feel like we're going to bring people down around us. We feel like there's a problem with the fact that we experience grief at all, so we just kind of pretend it's not there. We cry silently into ourselves in our rooms. We excuse ourselves and walk to the bathroom. That's where our grief tends to come out, and I want you to know Jesus wept, and you can weep. Being sad at the holidays does not mean that there's not joy at the holidays. It means that you're sad. And as husbands, we oftentimes, because we don't know what to do with our wife's grief, we oftentimes just kind of want to pretend it's not there. And when she gets choked up, when she gets emotional, we'll just kind of go back to the TV, or we'll go back to something else that's going on, and we're going to give her chance to get herself back together. Jesus wept. We should too. We're not told in this passage, Jesus held it together. That would be a much different verse. Jesus took a deep breath and was strong for the people around him. That's not what it says. Jesus wept. And it's okay with us. It's okay for us to weep as well. Now, something else I want you to see moving beyond verse 37. Jesus wept, and we're told he was moved. Now, whether you read that, we don't have insight into his thinking. We're not told Jesus wept because he thought this. We're just told Jesus wept, and then we're told he was moved. Now, whether you read that as Jesus weeping because he himself was grieving, or you read that as he was weeping because he was moved by the grief of others around him, he wept, and it was related to grief. He experienced grief, and I want you to know as a counselor, one of the most difficult aspects of grief, one of the hardest things to convince people is when they come in and say, how do I get past this? How do I get over this? I hear that a lot. How do I get over this? The answer is you don't get over it. You have to get through it, because over it implies you can skip stuff. Through it implies you can't. We have to let ourselves experience our grief, and the more we pretend it's not there, the more we mask it, the more we swallow that lump in our throat, the more we drag it out. I think for us, it's okay to feel what we're feeling. And if this holiday season, if you have a moment where you're full of grief, it's okay. Be full of grief. Jesus wept, and so can you. The second thing I want to point to is Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha are fascinating parts of this story, and the reason for that is because of what they do with their grief. Now, I want to remind you, Mary and Martha have just lost their brother. Okay, this is a very personal moment. This is a grief-filled moment. They've just lost their brother. Mary and Martha, however, handle this grief in completely different ways. And if you pay attention to how they handle their grief, I think a few truths are going to be shown to you. One is that grief is personal. It is not formulaic. Despite what we want to believe, people can experience grief in different ways. There's not a prescribed passage of emotion that we need to feel. The Kubler-Ross stuff, we have a misperception as to what that is. So we don't, for the sake of time, we don't go too deep into that. Let me simply mention this. Grief can look very unique to everyone and yet can still be felt entirely. I want to look at what Mary and Martha did. Take a look at verse 21, and then also take a look in verse 32. Compare those two verses, and here's what you see. You see these two sisters approaching Jesus with their grief, and they begin by uttering the exact same sentence. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. They both opened with this exact same sentence. So these are two sisters who both experienced the death of their brother. They're both grieving. They both bring their grief to Jesus. They open by telling Jesus that if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But then they take two completely different paths for their grief. Let's focus first on Martha. Martha follows up that sentence. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. She follows it with a conversation. She came out to Jesus and talked. It almost, to me, reads as though Martha had processed her outward grief differently, or perhaps she was processing it differently. In verse 22, she says the phrase, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And then in verse 22, she says, but even now, God will give you whatever you ask. She's moving into a logical, concrete way of working her way through her grief. She's sad, so she goes to Jesus and wants a conversation, and what happens is they have a doctrinal conversation about death and about what Jesus means to us, because that's the kind of comfort that she needed. There are those of us who need logical thinking when we experience grief. Oftentimes, and I was just a little hard on husbands because we don't oftentimes support the grief of our wives. There are a lot of husbands, however, who grieve logically. They grieve by thinking through what happens next, what comes next, and then when it's time to grieve, they grieve by focusing on good memories in the past and how things are functionally going to be different in the future. And a lot of wives accuse husbands of not grieving because that's what they're doing. The reality is we can grieve in different ways. Martha grieved in a very logical, very sequential way. She processed through her pain and she realized God had a plan, and so her grief seemed to be less obvious on the surface. Now, compare that to Mary. How did Mary grieve? Same process. Loses her brother, goes to Jesus. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. But then within a sentence of that sentence, she's crying. She's weeping. She delivers the exact same line and then begins weeping. Maybe she wasn't as far along in her emotional process. Maybe she was just more emotional. But regardless, she handled her grief in a much more outwardly emotional way. Now, if you think about these two women that we're talking about and you think about who they were, the fact that they processed their grief this way is actually not surprising. If you back up in Luke 10, there's a moment where Martha is busying herself preparing a meal while Jesus is teaching. She's kind of got herself active. She's putting stuff together. And in that story, what's Mary doing? Mary's sitting at the feet of Jesus listening. You can kind of see the different personality types. Martha the more aggressive, the more take charge, the more what's the next thing we need to do. I've seen her described as the more aggressive sister. She was more action-oriented, where Mary was more quiet and contemplative. She was, in addition to being the one who sat at Jesus' feet as he was teaching, she was described earlier in this passage as the one who poured perfume on Jesus' feet and washed him with her hair. I think it's safe to say that Mary was a bit more feelings-oriented, and Martha was a bit more action-oriented. They both experienced the same incident. They started with the same thought and then went in completely different ways with their grief. The takeaway to me, grief is a personal process, and there is no wrong way to do it. If your grief looks like logical thinking, if it looks like what do we need to do next, what holes do we need to fill in our schedule to ensure that we get X done or Y done, if that's your grief, take it, own it, that is okay. If your grief is to stop and cry when you hear a certain song or to become overwhelmed by emotion when a certain thing happens, that's okay too. Nowhere in this passage does Jesus scold these women for the way that they process their grief. They process their grief in different ways, and it's okay for us to do that too. And the reason that it's okay for us to do that too is because of the third point I want you to look at tonight. I want you to pay attention to what Jesus did with each of these sisters. He saw grief. I want to remind you again, we're told specifically that Jesus loved these people that he's grieving with. He loved them. There was personal feelings here. This is not a counselee relationship where there's a disconnect, there's an emotional disconnect. We didn't really know each other. They're just coming to me to help me process through the grief. These are people that Jesus loved, and I want you to see how he handles their grief. For Martha, the more practical, the more logical sister, Jesus has a theological, doctrinal conversation with her. He gives her exactly what she needs in the moment that she needs it. What she needed was a conversation, so he gave her a conversation. With Mary, exact same scenario, exact same family, exact same trigger. She weeps, so he weeps with her. It's what she needed. If you are one of those people tonight who's not grieving personally, who as you hear me talk about grief, if you're one of those people tonight who thinks, well, I mean, we've lost people, but I don't feel like I'm in grief. A, good, wonderful. God bless you for it. But B, it's possible there are people in your life who are experiencing grief. And when that happens, I want you to think about the way that Jesus handles Mary and Martha. He doesn't try to talk them out of their grief. He doesn't try to tell them all the reasons that they shouldn't be sad. You know, one of the things, and it comes from a great place, but one of the things that we do at funerals, one of the things that we do when we know someone's lost someone, inadvertently, we offer them things to try and talk them out of their grief. We talk about how, well, at least the pain's over now. We talk about how they're in a better place. We talk about how the funerals are just for us and we're the ones who are sad. And all those things are true, and they're loving, and they're kind, and they come from a good place. But there are times where we just need to weep with those who weep. There are times when rather than try to talk our loved ones out of their grief, we simply need to grieve with them. We don't rationalize it away. A few years ago, before April and I had kids, we were living in Uptown, and it was a very busy area where we lived. There was a lot of activity, there was a lot of movement, and April was out jogging one night, and I was at home by myself, and the phone rang, and it was my dad. You know when you answer the phone and you know something's wrong? You know, there's a weird tone. They say your name differently. They say hello differently. I knew something was wrong. My dad was calling because he'd been to the doctor that morning, and they'd found a brain tumor. The elders and the ministers here know this because we've had extended conversations about this, but my dad is a very special place in my life. We talk all the time. He is a confidant. He is a friend. And that news was tough. It was the shortest conversation we've ever had. My wife has accused me of spending more time talking to my dad than anybody else in my life, because there are times where we will start talking about Lions football, which is a rough conversation, and then we'll end up talking about ministry and about counseling and about life, and I'll look down and it's been 2 hours. That phone call lasted about 3 minutes. And the reason for that was because while my dad and I are very open with each other, he does not like to show emotion in front of his boys. And so on the phone, he told me what was going on. He gave me just the facts, and then I could hear it. I could hear the lump in his throat. He needed to get off the phone, so I let him, and I hung up, and all of a sudden I'm in a room by myself, in a house by myself, in an apartment, in an area that's booming and full of people everywhere, and I've never felt so alone in my life. All I could think to do was walk downstairs and sit on the sidewalk. I had no plan. I had no trajectory. I just sat on the sidewalk, and everything kind of went blank. I couldn't see past the end of my nose. I couldn't hear anything that was going on, and the only thing that got me out of that was April showing back up. And she finished her run, and she obviously could see me sitting on the sidewalk. And her words to me were first, "What happened?" That's the only thing she could think to say, "What happened?" And I don't even know what I said. I don't know how I got it out, but I explained to her what I'd just gotten in that phone call. And I remember her reaction to that was to simply sit next to me and put her arm around me. And I did then what I do now, which was that was my moment where it was okay to cry. It was my moment where it was okay to grieve. She didn't say anything. There was nothing she could have said in that moment that would have made anything better. There was nothing she could have said in that moment that would have made me feel optimistic. There was nothing she could have said in that moment that would have made me feel any better. So she just sat with me, put an arm around me, and cried. For those of you who aren't in grief, but the people around you are, sometimes you weep with those who weep. And it's the most powerful thing in the world. In that moment, she met me where I was. And the reason I say that to you tonight is because that's what Jesus did with Mary and Martha. He met them where they were. They did two things with Jesus that I want to make sure you hear. Number one, they believed. Verse 25, Jesus says to Martha, "The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? Again in verse 40, and we didn't read it, but again in verse 40, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" To experience the full comfort of Christ in those moments of grief, we have to believe in the things that we say we believe. We have to believe that God's in control. We have to believe that our salvation is guaranteed. We have to believe that He has a plan for us even when there's pain. And we have to believe that He understands what we're feeling. Secondly, and this is the most important part of the interaction between Mary and Martha to me, the most important part is that you'll notice geographically where all this took place. And I don't mean city-wise. Where did this all take place? Jesus waited, and they came to Jesus. They brought their grief to Jesus. I think that's important. They were intentional. Martha was a bit more aggressive. She was the first one out of the gate. She ran straight to Jesus. But when she came back and told Mary that Jesus was there, Mary did the same. Jesus didn't chastise them for their grief. He didn't tell them how to do it. He didn't tell them to get over it. He doesn't tell them that their faith is weak because death is the blessing we all get for our faith. He doesn't say that. He doesn't correct their thinking because Jesus understands our pain. We can bring our pain to Jesus, and when we do, we can see that even in our suffering, God is glorified. See, our suffering is rooted in losing the earthly component of the incredible blessings that God's bestowed upon us. I talked last week about the blessings in our life. The amount of pain we feel in moments of grief is equal to the amount of love that God gave us in those relationships. Grief is the loss of something we felt blessed by. So how amazing is it that God gave us something worthy of being that broken by? God can be glorified in our grief. The more we hurt, the closer we were in that relationship. I had a client who asked me once, he had lost his wife, and he asked me, he said, "How do you get rid of the ghosts?" He said, "I see her everywhere." He said, "I see her in the kitchen. I see her in the living room. I see her everywhere we go. How do we get rid of the ghosts?" And the only thing I could think to say was, "I don't think you do. I think every time you see those ghosts, you thank God that you were lucky enough to have her in your life and that He gives you that vivid memory of who she is." In our grief, God is glorified. In our pain, Jesus understands. He meets us where we are, and He can give us what we need. He doesn't rush us through it. He doesn't explain it away. He doesn't shame us for experiencing it, but we have to bring our grief to Jesus. We don't grieve alone. We grieve with the Father. Martha wasn't just talking to Mary in verse 28. I think she was talking to us. In this holiday season, when things get hard, when pain creeps in, when sorrows like sea billows roll, I want you to hear Martha's words. The teacher is here and is asking for you. When you don't feel like you can go on, the teacher is here and he's asking for you. When that lump in your throat in the middle of Christmas morning feels like it's going to choke you, the teacher is here and he's asking for you. And when the joy you see in the season around you can't seem to penetrate the pain that you're feeling inside, the teacher is here and he's asking for you.